Today, we have made the decision to keep the key rate at 4.25% per annum. The economy continues to recover, albeit at a slower pace than in summer. Financial markets are still characterized by elevated volatility and geopolitical risks persist. Moreover, the epidemiological situation is deteriorating, which may increase demand-side disinflationary pressure. I would like to dwell on the factors we consider today. Firstly, inflation processes are generally evolving in line with our baseline scenario. We forecast that inflation will come in at 3.9 to 4.2% by the end of the year. Stable inflation indicators are close to 4%. However, demand and supply-side factors are changing unevenly, having different impacts on prices in individual goods and service groups. The effect of pent-up demand on inflation has been mostly exhausted. The weakening of the ruble continues to affect the price growth rate. This is evident in non-food categories in the first place. There is also a range of one-off factors temporarily slowing down the rise in service prices. Specifically, given the current epidemiological situation, the authorities have recommended to limit the increase in prices for educational services. A number of regions have made decisions on only partial indexation of housing and utility rates. Further on, these prices may adjust over time, and we take this into account in our inflation forecast. Secondly, inflation expectations have increased. To a certain extent, they are responding to exchange rate fluctuations. Businesses are also reporting a rise in costs. Thirdly, the economic recovery has slowed down, predominantly due to domestic demand trends. This is evident from investment and consumption trends, as well as the leading indicators of consumer and business activity. As noted above, the positive effect of pent-up demand has been mostly exhausted by now. This demand was driving the fast revival of economic activity immediately after the cancellation of the restrictions imposed in spring and summer. This recovery was primarily recorded in sectors focused on consumer goods production. The revival in intermediate goods industries was less pronounced. However, the deteriorating epidemiological situation is hampering the growth of consumption expenditures, affecting companies' investment plans. It is still highly uncertain how fast the global economy will be recovering, especially with account of repeated restrictions being imposed in a number of countries. The economic environment is also being affected by geopolitical factors, including trade tensions, the Brexit situation, and the upcoming elections in the USA. The decline in sentiment is increasingly volatility in global markets. In such conditions, external demand may hardly be expected to support the economy. The fourth factor is monetary conditions. We can see that the earlier decisions on the key rate continue to translate into the easing of monetary conditions and banks' pricing policies. Along with a decrease in interest rates, non-price lending conditions are also easing. In addition, we also factor in that the preferential corporate and retail lending programs are becoming increasingly important. In August, the portion of subsidized mortgage loans exceeded 35% in the overall amount of loans disbursed. The total monthly amount of issued mortgage loans hit its record high. As regards lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, the percentage of short-term loans issued at interest rates that are close to 2% per annum rose in August from 1/4 to 1/3 of their overall amount. These programs are also indirectly influencing the general pricing environment in the credit market. And in the future, we will be estimating how monetary conditions are adjusting as these programs terminate. Now I will proceed to the forecast. Today, as always, after the core meeting, we have published our updated baseline scenario. When revising our forecast, we considered a range of factors. The ruble has weakened. The period of the recovery growth, that is, the initial rebound after the lifting of the spring restrictions, has almost ended. The epidemiological situation is deteriorating, which is already affecting economic activity. Nonetheless, export dynamics have turned out to be better than expected for both oil and gas exports and the exports of other goods, especially gold. Taking into account the overall impact of competing factors, the GDP forecast has been revised upwards. According to estimates, GDP will go down by 4 to 5% as of the end of 2020, which is better than it was expected in July. As to domestic demand indicators, their overall dynamics as of the end of 2020 are expected to be worse than forecast in July. This is associated with the released data on GDP components for the second quarter. The restrictions that were in place over this period had a stronger negative impact on both investments and consumption than it had been assumed. However, the recovery in the third quarter was also faster than forecast. Furthermore, as you know, GDP results for the second quarter were generally better than our preliminary estimates. This was associated with higher exports indicators over this period compared to expectations. Amid the deterioration of the pandemic situation in the fourth quarter and possibly in the beginning of 2021, economic revival will be somewhat slower than we forecast earlier. Therefore, GDP growth in 2021 has been revised downwards by 0.5 percentage point to 3 to 4%. Making this adjustment, we took into account the effect of the higher base of 2020, given that the 2020 GDP forecast has been improved. Now, a few words about the 2022 to 2023 horizon. At the moment, our forecast assumptions and parameters have remained unchanged. The economy will expand by 2.5 to 3.5 in 2022 and by 2 to 3% in 2023. We still expect that we will return to the pre-crisis level in the first half of 2022. Given the current monetary policy stance, inflation is forecast to stand at 3.5 to 4% in 2021 and further remain close to 4%. Regarding the balance of payments forecast, it has been significantly updated, primarily due to the upward adjustment of export estimates. The current account is expected to be notably higher over the entire forecast horizon. This is related to both the adjusted volume and the expected price environment for Russian export products. We have updated the 2021 average oil price assumption from $40 to $45 per barrel, taking into account the current price movements and assuming that the situation in the oil market will remain stable. Regarding the fiscal policy, we build our baseline forecast on the figures specified in the draft fiscal policy guidelines for 2021 to 2023. However, when making our key rate decisions, we will consider potential adjustments in the measures implemented by the government. Another factor that we take into account is the specifics of the operation of the transmission mechanism in the current conditions. Increased financial market volatility requires that we consider financial stability aspects in our key rate decisions. In a normal situation, cutting the key rate should prompt a decline in interest rates on all financial instruments and a certain weakening of the ruble, which altogether would lead to an easing of monetary conditions. However, in an unstable situation in financial markets with elevated risks, a key rate cut could lead to an increase in interest rates on long-term financial instruments and a more pronounced reaction of the exchange rate than in steady conditions. As a result, monetary conditions could even tighten. Therefore, we should carefully use our room for monetary policy easing, given potential financial stability risks. In conclusion, I would like to speak about our further steps. As I have already said, the worsening of the pandemic situations will have mainly disinflationary effects. A potential slowdown in the global economy will have similar consequences. At the same time, short-term pro-inflationary risks stemming from the situation in financial markets have strengthened recently. The upward pressure on prices can also be exerted if the epidemiological situation causes a notable influence on both demand for and supply of goods and services. Although the ratio of pro-inflationary and disinflationary factors may change over the short-term horizon, we believe that disinflationary risks prevail in the medium term. Therefore, we still see room for a key rate decrease. A more significant influence of disinflationary factors may require more prolonged and potentially more pronounced accommodative monetary policy than it is currently stipulated in our baseline scenario. However, we also take into account that it is important to ensure that our monetary policy is stable under any scenarios in order to maintain inflation close to 4%. This is especially important today when so many diverse factors are influencing the current situation. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I am ready to answer your questions. Please, the first questions from Fabricne Elena, Reuters. Good afternoon. Will there be any chance remaining for the rate to be lowered during the last core meeting in December after the main geopolitical risks of the year related to the US elections comes to manifest itself? Well, yes, we indeed confirm that the room to reduce the key rate remains, bearing in mind also the fact that the evolution of the epidemiological environment strengthens disinflationary potential. But we will definitely assess the current indicators. We will further fine-tune our forecasts, taking into account geopolitical situations and in the financial markets when making our decision. What does it mean? It means that every time during the Board of Directors meeting, we will be revisiting the assessment of whether we can use such a room in order to go for a respective decision. Thank you. Next question, Maria Stepanova from TASS Agency. Good afternoon. Yes, good day, Elvira Sakhipisandovna. I wanted to ask you about the subsidized mortgage. Last week, Ministry of Finance submitted its draft resolution into the government to further extend the program until the middle of next year. Previously, it was discussed that it would be extended until the end of 2021. What do you think? What would be the optimum timing, and wouldn't the extension of this program would overheat the mortgage market? Thank you. We have supported the extension of the subsidized mortgage program till the middle of next year. And we are of the opinion that this program indeed is very effective and very much in demand. And it has demonstrated itself as a very successful tool of an anti-crisis policy. But speaking about its future, one should definitely think about the consequences that may involve, because currently we don't see any risks of overheating, so that you understand it now. But we must be very cognizant of the housing prices. And what do we need the subsidized mortgage program for? In order to improve the availability of housing to people. And so it is important that the decrease of the key rate that is taking place is influenced by the monetary policy as well as by the government subsidization in mortgage programs, so that this win for the people wouldn't be cannibalized by the housing prices growing. And so in such programs, we must make sure that the supply is not the bottleneck, and that we are not ending up with prices really climbing up. Currently, we see that the price growth for housing is ahead of inflation. So the second factor, which I believe we should also take into account, is while developing mortgage market, and so in this country, the mortgage market is less developed than in other economies, and so the mortgage penetration should be stronger, but that must evolve along with the growing incomes for households. It is important for the quantity of people to grow who can afford to service mortgage. If the subsidized programs may only lead to the deferred demand on the part of the household manifesting itself sooner thanks to the subsidized programs, and later on, once the programs are terminated, this demand will shrink. And this in itself may lead to the housing prices falling very dramatically, and respectively, it will lead to a reassessment of the mortgage risks by the banks, which in its way will make the bank slow down their mortgage lending activity. So we need to really monitor it so as to avoid such dramatic changes in the mortgage markets. And possibly the third thing that I would like to note, indeed, very successful anti-crisis instrument it is, but it doesn't have to necessarily be turned into a standing instrument, because if the prevalent majority of the mortgage instruments will be pegged to the subsidized rates, non-market rates, administered rates, and that is quite a big and growing market segment against all other things being equal. This would mean that if the monetary policy is brought in line with the inflation target for other loan recipients, we will need to maintain higher rates. And so there shouldn't be such distortions, but in terms of it being an anti-crisis tool, we will definitely support the mortgage program to run until the middle of next year. Next question from Anna Kaledina from Izvestia. In the comments to the decisions, you specify the slowdown of the recovery growth in September, as well as different risks growing because of the second pandemic wave. But at the same time, the central bank improves its update on the GDP forecast and for next year. Why? And also, you talk a lot about in the comments about the growing risks of implementing alternative scenarios. Why? One has to put an emphasis upon the baseline one in this case. As far as improving our GDP forecast is concerned, it is indeed related to a better export forecast. Again, based on the actuals that we're currently tracking, because in July, when we came out with the previous forecast, we looked into the export dynamics and saw that it was worse than the actual indicators were, and that was one of the core parameters to improve GDP forecast this year. Next year, on the contrary, we have slightly reduced our forecast, which reflects both the base effect, like we mentioned previously, and, amongst other things, the worsening in the epidemiological situation, which is currently taking place. And in as far as the alternative risk scenarios are concerned, rightly so, we are following the baseline scenario, which we believe to be the baseline for our decision-making, but against there being so many uncertainties, it is quite feasible that situation may follow different kinds of scenarios. And so at this point in time, we are talking about a very important principle of our monetary policy, which is the stability of our decisions in terms of different scenarios, demonstrating different level of robustness, as they say, i.e. our decisions must be validated, even if life takes a totally different turn. And so, unfortunately, in the current set of uncertainties, that may happen. For example, back in July, when we put together a baseline forecast, we didn't effectively include the risks of epidemiological situation worsening further that is taking place, because in September we made such conclusions, but we currently have included it into our baseline scenario. And the baseline scenario, we distinguish it because we believe it to be most probable. We believe it to be even more probable than the totality of all of the alternative scenarios put together. Next question from Anastasia Saveleva, Interfax. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I wanted to ask you the following question. Don't you see the risks in the current weakening of the ruble and the previous depreciation, the possible risks to financial stability? Do you note those? Don't you feel that the central bank needs to meddle into this process because you've got respective tools, or maybe an indirect participation of the Bank of Russia, like, for example, have a conversation with the exporters? The second question is about the OFZ. Don't you see the risks in the current setup whereby the banks are buying the government bonds from the primary auctions using the long-term repo from the Bank of Russia? So the risks of different maturity of these instruments. And don't you believe that effectively this is a bit of a quasi-funding by the Bank of Russia of the federal deficit? Well, in terms of the current dynamics, we don't see any risks to financial stability, because the currency exchange rate really comes out of various different factors, impact reflecting the events taking place. There is sufficient liquidity in the market, and the trading volumes are quite normal, so we do not see any considerable risks here. So there is no need for any special interference. Now, particularly, speaking to the exporters, because I would say that the exporters, in a very stable way, were selling their export currency revenues. So I don't see any risks here, but in our forecast, we definitely take into account the changes taking place whenever we make a decision. And I should say that overall, the exchange rate fluctuations, yes, this year it has been higher than what is expected, but comparable to 2018, because whenever different events are unfolding, then there are periods of such a high volatility. And this volatility is not only the depreciation because over the past, over the recent times, we also note the exchange rate strengthening. Now, as far as the long-term repo transactions are concerned, neither we see risks here. We make funds available within the monthly and the annual repo in the first place, but essentially this is a short-term kind of funding of a recoverable nature, and simply because the banks are eager to support their liquidity towards the end of the year, because usually towards the end of the year we end up having the unevenness in terms of the budget liquidity even stronger this year, because the budget in a advance kind of progression borrows money in the market, and the main spending is going to be deferred towards the end of the year. For example, we see that in September the budget deficit was about 200 billion rubles, and in the market the government borrowed a little bit over 830 billion. So effectively, this is the kind of demand that the banks have produced upon our transactions, and so this money is indeed revocable. It is being sterilized because simultaneously we do undertake absorption of the liquidity in order for the rate to remain within the middle of our operational range at the level of the key rate. I mean, there's the short-term money market rate. That is also related to the problem that I've described previously, which was in an even distribution of liquidity in this kind of a market. So we don't see any risk there. Thank you. The next question. Andrei Birikov from Bloomberg. Yes, good afternoon, Elvira Sepisanovna. You mentioned that you've included the pandemic risks and that this may require a much more pronounced, softer monetary policy. Could you please explain, are you talking about the extension of the time frame for the softer monetary policy for 2022-23, or about a certain depth to which the key rate may go down compared to the base scenario that you produced in September? Oh, yes. We are definitely going to watch over the way the situation is going to develop. As I've mentioned, the current environment does pronounce disinflationary risks for the next year period. And in the baseline scenario, we do see that next year we're going to pursue a softer policy. Now, the time frame for the softer policy and the extent to which it is going to be more emphasized in relation to the key rate decline will depend upon the situation, and we will be monitoring and making our decisions accordingly. Next question from Dmitry Butin, Kommersant. Good afternoon. If you compare it to the kind of forecast that you produced by July 24th, the biggest changes here is the lower expectations in terms of the ultimate consumption in between the households, but simultaneously it has strengthened the forecast in terms of the M2 indicator. I mean, the banks are lending to the economy and households, and apparently that will be more active in 2021 than in 2020 and 2019. Is it the same process or different? And what is happening to the saving standard that is going to not shrink but even to grow? And that will also flow, I'm sure, into 2021. Yes, you're quite right. This is one of very important issues, i.e. how this whole current situation affects the propensity to save and consume. Because if we run a softer monetary policy, undoubtedly we intend to support consumption, the household consumers' consumption. But in the current environment and the way the epidemiological situation demonstrates itself and the overall economic environment, the households do have incentives to act in a cautious way, and households are trying to save in such an environment. As long as they don't see clear for future and understanding when their incomes are going to recover, amongst other things, that is related to the demand for cash that we've registered, and this is the trend that is taking place in many countries. We are very scrupulously analyzing all the data currently related to the household's financial behavior in terms of what happens with the deposits, what happens to investing into the stock market, and how the need for cash changes, and we correlate it naturally to what is taking place with the end consumption and retail trade. So there are quite a few incentives requiring additional analysis, because this is one of the set of important factors which affects our monetary policy, definitely. Now, the next question, please, from Roman Markelov, the Russian Gazette. Can one state that the key factor for the key rate to sustain was specifically the ruble rate going down? And to what extent this particular factor can become more significant by December the 18th meeting of the Board of Directors? Well, we take the ruble exchange rate, the exchange rate dynamics when making our decisions. But in this case, one should rather talk not about the ruble exchange rate going down and thus becoming a key factor. We do take into account in our forecast, because the weakening of the ruble that has occurred will create a bit of an pro-inflationary effect in the course of the next 9 to 10 months. So, principally speaking, the situation in the financial markets, the global financial markets, was important to take into account, and all the considerations related to it. And the extent to which it's going to be significant in December is hard to predict, because in December it may be a totally different situation that we will need to be confronted by. Anna Britko from Forbes. Good afternoon. My question is about the outflow of net capital, because the central bank worsened its forecast almost twofold in terms of the net capital outflow. The question is, what is the explanation? What kind of factors you took into account in the first place when putting together such a forecast, and also for 2021 and 2022? What do you think will happen to it? Right. Against the floating exchange rate, I should say that the capital movement is the reflection of the current account status, adjusted by our currency reserves transactions. We have seriously improved our exports forecast, in terms of the positive current account surplus, which is reflected in the capital account dynamics. Next question comes from Anastasia Saprikina, RIA Novosti. What do you think? Has the transfer of the weakening of the ruble in August manifested itself in prices, and this weakening of the ruble, what kind of contribution it made into inflation? Well, I have already started saying that this weakening has not yet been fully transferred into prices, because this conversion is extended in time, and it may take up to 9 to 12 months in duration. But generally speaking, our conversion indicators of the ruble exchange rate into prices has gone down quite tangibly compared to what it was 5 years ago. Based on our estimates, it has shrunk almost threefold. So we see it right now at the level of 0.5, 0.6. 0.05, 0.06. And if you except that the exchange rate remains stable, then the weakening that occurred in August and September by spring next year will contribute 1 percentage point to inflation. Next question from Elizaveta Bazanova, V-Times. When the central bank was updating its forecast in July, the exchange rate was 70 rubles to a dollar. In the weakening of the ruble for 10% during the past months, you practically hasn't changed your inflation forecast. What factors compensated for the weakening of the currency exchange, or has this weakening been expected by the central bank to happen? Like I stated previously, the impact of the exchange rate on the prices is extended in time. Additionally, the weakening of the exchange rate, which has already occurred, is a pro-inflation effect, a one-off. But simultaneously, I would say that disinflationary factors also took hold, first of all, related to the assessment of the domestic demand because of the epidemiological situation. Next question from Elena Kireva, Bank NN from Nizhny Novgorod. Good afternoon, please. Go ahead. Good afternoon, Elvira Sahibzadovna. On September 10th, 2020, the central bank published its first draft of the main monetary policy guidelines for 3 years into the future. The modest forecast of the real growth in monetary mass are planned at about 4 to 5% per annum. Does it mean that in terms of any economic breakthrough, one shouldn't expect it to happen, or the central bank is already preparing amendments into the previously published draft? Thank you for the question. Well, let me begin by saying that the main source of the money mass is not the monetary emission by the central bank, like many believe, but the banking credit, and the correlation between the economic growth rate as well as the lending rate is bilateral, meaning to say that as long as the banks see the future in better potential in economic growth, they are much keener to be more active in lending, and so that supports the economic growth. But in their turn, the readiness on the part of the bank to lend and the readiness of the borrowers, I mean the corporates and the households, to take loans is also dependent in the first place upon the expectations on the part of the economic agents, the households and the businesses towards the economic growth and how the economy is going to evolve. And the households definitely must be aware of what is going to happen to their incomes and how they're going to service their credits. So this linkage is bilateral and mutual, but I would like to further specify that based on the results of 2020, as we expect, the money mass growth will be 14 to 17% in nominal terms, which is above 10% in real terms. So that does reflect the fact that this year the banks have been quite actively lending. So currently the growth rate in lending is higher than last year. Next question comes from Anna Baitakova, CoinDesk. Good afternoon. The central bank recently published a report about a possible launching of a digital ruble. Why such project is of interest to the central bank? Now, how realistic it is to see this project being launched in the immediate future, you believe, and what kind of feedback you receive to your report? Well, in our mind, it really has raised a lot of interest. We are already getting feedback, and hopefully we'll still get more of it because we are truly interested in discussing the future of introducing a digital ruble as broadly as possible with the general public, with the businesses, with all the stakeholders. And we do see this project, on the one hand, having a lot of potential, and we also believe that it's very intricately fits into the development of the digital economy, because the digital transformation is taking place, and without doubt, the system of settlements must transform itself, because we do see how turbulently it is developing in this country, different payment systems, mobile banks, remote services, and so the digital ruble is yet another step towards such an outcome. Now, how realistic it is to see this project taking off? Yes, it is quite realistic, but we need to evaluate the advantages and compare them with the risks that there are, because the risks are there, and we've also described them in our report, in our advisory report, and we would like to assess this balance, respectively, in between the risks and the merits. But after the advisory report is discussed, because we're going to be receiving the feedback towards the end of the year, we will then analyze it. And if the decision is made to launch this project, we will prepare a full concept, followed by, as we believe, a very necessary stage of a limited piloting by a limited number of users, so as to test everything, so that we understand the way it will work. And this kind of a piloting, we believe, can happen towards the end of next year. And as the results emerge, we will decide how to move on. But the most important thing right now is to assess the merits and the risks in it. The next question from Ivan Schligen, former good afternoon. During all of the previous crises, we observed such a phenomenon that there was a ruble devaluation in a mandatory way and a very high inflation. So right now, we don't observe a high inflation, but there is the weakening of the ruble. Does it mean that we've been able to say that we're passing through this crisis quite all right, or we shouldn't be complacent just yet? Well, from the point of view of the fact that we have achieved the kind of a threshold when the currency dynamics is not so immediately impacting the prices, yes, this is true. And that is the advantage of targeting the inflation and introducing the floating exchange rate. So from this viewpoint, yes, but the exchange rate dynamic is not the only, and I would rather say not the most important definition of a crisis. The basic thing that we need to say, meaning that we pass through this period, it's when the economy has recovered, when the employment has recovered, the incomes has recovered, and we are into a stable development trend. So the next question comes from Pavel Kazarnovsky from RBK. Good afternoon. Has the central bank assessed the amount of paper money that it can take out of the circulation by distributing digital ruble? How much central bank plans to save on curtailing the emission through the digital ruble, and how are you going to popularize the use of the digital ruble? Well, first of all, we are not targeting displacing some sort of form of money. It's going to be a third form of money alongside with cash and cashless instruments currently existing, and both the households and the businesses will be choosing for which particular kind of an application, which kind of ruble would be more convenient for them to use. And so our task is to provide for the expediency and agility of going in between these different forms, so we're not setting ourselves any specific tasks in terms of their mission. Even if a positive decision made to introduce the digital ruble and further circulate it is going to be very gradual, because people are going to be, looking at it, trying to make up their minds in terms of what can be done with the digital ruble. And so financial literacy programs would be very important so that people would be quite knowledgeable about how to better use the digital ruble. So that's my answer. Next question comes from Anatoly Pestich, TASS Agency. Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. In the digital ruble report, you specified that the digital currency will have a certain unique code, will have a certain serial number and whatnot. Doesn't mean that the central bank will be able to trace the whole life cycle of the digital ruble, as well as trace all of the transactions that it will be applied to. If positive, who will have access to such information? And would it mean that there would be a certain loss of anonymity when somebody would like to use a digital ruble? Yes, indeed, it is anticipated that there will be a unique code attached, which will improve transparency of transacting in a digital ruble currency. But at the same time, it is nevertheless expected we shouldn't confuse anonymity and confidentiality of such transactions. Because it is true there won't be anonymity in the sense that you are familiar with dealing in cash, but confidentiality is expected to be made stronger. The central bank will hold a register of the digital currency of the central bank. Now, will anyone else will be in a position to observe the transactions would also depend upon the kind of choices made in favor of which particular model for the digital ruble function, because in our advisory report we've described several models with a greater involvement on the part of the commercial banks, as well as with a lesser involvement on their part. And by the way, in the current cashless transaction forms in rubles, the commercial settlements that are run by the banks, they do see what's happening. So situation here will slightly alter, but we come from the notion that the digital ruble must have the maximum trust, and the maximum confidentiality is one of the imperatives to comply with when introducing a digital ruble. Next question comes from Artemis Zavarzin, Region 29 TV channel from Archangel City. It is interesting to hear what the central bank thinks. And does the reduction of the key rate several times a year demonstrate that one shouldn't take money into the bank? This could be a person in the street thinking, but many people really are thinking about that they're better off keeping their money in a mattress than taking them to the bank. Well, see, savings inside a bank, from the point of view of them being saved in a deposit, remains attractive. Because, yes, it is true that the deposit rates have somewhat declined, similar to the case in the lending rates, but they remain higher than inflation. I mean, the kind of money that you keep in a bank not only is kept intact and retains their purchasing power, but similarly creates a moderate income. And of course, the people who are eager to enjoy a higher income, keeping money at home, it means that not getting any revenue stream, and this kind of money is going to really lose its purchasing power by the ratio of inflation. But what we see right now is that people are interested to somewhat gain more in terms of what their money can afford them, and quite a few venture out into the stock markets and financial markets. But I would like to underscore again that the income level depends upon the level of risks. Inside the banks, indeed, this is a very low level of risk, considering a very effective deposit insurance system in place. But if you go out into the stock market and you want to earn more, you should definitely look into what kind of product it is, what kind of risks are there, because there are so many complex products available that it's very difficult to sort out things about them. And whenever somebody is offering you some unusually attractive income, you need to do some work and try and understand what kind of an instrument it is in order to not end up being in a predicament. Nevertheless, various instruments offered by the banks in this line do offer an opportunity to earn more and save money. And we, as the central bank, we pursue the policy to protect the rights of investors in the financial market, particularly unqualified investors. And this particular objective, as a task, would only become more important in statute. Next question from Tatiana Shubasova from Interfax. Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, I can. You mentioned the second pandemic wave, and so my question is, does the central bank consider the possibility to reduce some of the regulative easing for the banks? And can you stop some of the easing programs and while bring back the others, the ones that expired on September 30th this year? Another question is, part of the draft budget for the next 3 years, the central bank is not going to receive 200 billion rubles from the sale of Sberbank, because this money was linked to the management practices and in dealing and resolving the situation with the stressed banks. Well, I would say that we're definitely counting to have it, and we are planning to receive it as soon as it is possible when the process is launched. And this is totally unrelated to what you are saying, but we have taken into account this very difficult situation that businesses and households find themselves in, meaning to say that they require financial resources to fund the programs for their support. Now, and as far as the first program is concerned, your question is concerned, regulatory easing, we are continuously easing and we are continuously monitoring situation in the banks, the way they are lending, the way they're restructuring their loans, in order for our regulation during this period of time to incentivize banks not to stop lending, not to stop restructuring of the loans. And the regulatory easings were aimed at that in order for the banks to be able to adjust themselves to any dramatic change out there. So, as you know, we did such an analysis in August, and we decided for many regulatory easings, specifically in as far as the loan restructurings are concerned for small businesses and households, to further extend it in time. At the same time, we also extend the benefits that allow the banks to continue restructuring the credits towards the end of the year and set up the impairment and reserves with respect to the loans to major borrowers until April the 1st, and with regard to the small and medium businesses and households until July 1st. This is one of the most sought-after measures, and we are definitely going to look how these measures are going to evolve. The the rest of the measures were not so much in demand. We currently don't see the conditions that would force us to think about bringing them back. But we'll definitely keep up with this analysis, and if it is necessary, we would be able to very quickly make up our mind. Next question comes from Anna Kaledna from Izvestia. In your comments, there is a certain hint at the government debt growing. Why central bank doesn't buy the overseas themselves and really provides the Ministry of Finance with an intermediary function and giving it an opportunity to invest into currency? A central bank doesn't plan to buy the overseas from the Ministry of Finance by itself. No, we are not planning to do that. And we are not purposefully funding the bank's transactions to buy the federal bonds. We provide this kind of liquidity in order for the banks to be able to govern themselves better against the conditions, like I previously stated, when the Ministry of Finance transactions are very uneven in terms of both the borrowing and spending. In our mind, these transactions are absolutely market-based in terms of their nature. You can see that we are placing these funds out with the key rate premium, and the Minister of Finance also does it within the market kind of framework. And apart from it all, we do ascertain that the banks are interested in buying the high liquidity assets because, for a long period of time, we experience a shortage, a deficit of the high liquidity assets. And in order to be able to comply with the standards, the central banks have offered a special kind of an instrument, irrevocable credit lines. And this situation was explained by the fact that we don't have too much of a government debt. I would say even that it is a very low government kind of debt, and it remains to be low. It has slightly grown, and the banks are interested in their asset structure to grow the share of the high liquidity assets. And actually, the share of high liquidity assets in the government securities is much lower in terms of their share portfolio compared to other countries. Yes, and the next questions come from Anna Baraulina from Bloomberg. Yes. Good afternoon. I've got another question about the digital ruble. I'm sorry. What is your personal thinking about what kind of pros and contras you find in this idea? Because I'm sure that you definitely have an opinion. And my second quick question, because of the recent arrest of one of the executives of the Trust Bank, to what extent it was a surprise? How do you read this situation? Will you have to hire somebody else in order to work with the distressed assets? Thank you. As far as the digital ruble is concerned, this is the assessment of this project. This is a very complex balance of pros and contras. The pros represent the convenience of settlement procedures, very convenient electronic form. A very big advantage could be as well that such settlements could be done offline, and whenever there is no internet connection even, you will still be in a position to perform such transactions. Digital currency can easily fit itself into the economic operations, like with the smart contracts, and in this way really ease the way the digital economy operates with the digital assets, because we recently have brought into effect the law on the digital financial assets, and I see them as very important advantages, and there is a demand for it. It is very much sought after, because we do observe the way very different payment systems evolve. instant payment system, because the instant payment system is quite popular. Both households and businesses do want to have a convenient, quick, instant settlement system, and a digital ruble is a digital ruble issued by the central bank, and that is why the central bank is committed to ensure the stability of this currency, and in this sense, that in itself is an advantage. Now, the contras, yes, they are related to the information security side of things. I mean, it's not really a drawback. It's a challenge, rather, to us how to build the technology to perform offline settlements with the digital rubles in as far as the online settlements concerned. Depending upon a specific model, everything is is more or less straightforward. Here we need to discuss what is the technology approach, and in terms of the technologically proven solutions, they aren't yet fully available. And so, subject to risk and analysis will be the way how its dissemination may affect the financial environment generally, although here I do say that the risks are quite minute, because the whole instrument, tool set, I mean, in the way we interact with the bank and the way we manage liquidity in such an environment, we have a very good idea of the way it should work. But nevertheless, we would definitely like to discuss it first with those who are going to use such a ruble, because there may be certain points that the market players will draw attention to, and so we'll further debate it. Now, yes, of course, it was a surprise, I mean, about the Trust Bank. Yes, we are interested in having the Trust Bank to successfully perform its function in working with the distressed assets and being able to return it. Although this particular episode is not related to any specific interaction with the Trust Bank, well, we would definitely need to think about the executive team about how to strengthen it, because Alexander Sokolov is currently leading the bank, and I believe that is going to be his decision what to do and how to organize the work in such a situation. The next question from Andrei Korchagin, Ulpravda portal from Ulyanovsk. What are the factors that are affecting macroeconomic forecasting, and how the current pandemic has affected your forecast considerations? Well, indeed, there are so many factors which do affect forecasting in this country, but certain changes have occurred over the recent years, whereas in the past, one of the core factors considered was the oil price. Over the recent years, it became possible to reduce the dependence of the economic development of the country and the fiscal indicators from the oil price, thanks to the fiscal role, thanks to the inflation targeting, thanks to the floating exchange rate, and actually thanks to various cushions and reserves to reduce this dependency. So whenever we are forecasting now, the oil price is of a lesser importance. I mean, it still does create an impact, but not as strong as it used to be. And the external environment, yes, of course, it also is at play, because we're the country which exports quite a lot, and so we need to fit into all of the global supply chains. And so the situation in the global economy, as well as in the global financial markets, is something that we do take into account as well. But without doubt, the basic things is the way the situation in the country is evolving nowadays, what happens to the economy, to the industrial output, to the employment, to the unemployment, to inflation, all put together. That is the way we do assess the future and forecast and assess various trends. Our colleagues do work in different modeling applications, and we currently are in a very serious uncertainty. Some situations, surface which are quite unexpected, like the case is with the pandemic and coronavirus. Nobody could expect that, and that has seriously impacted not only our forecast, but the whole world. And these things may emerge again. But what does it mean? Not in terms of forecasting. Whenever there is such a great uncertainty and some unexpected factors may come out and influence. It is important for all of the financial institutions and businesses to feel stability, and in case of such unexpected surprises, to enjoy respective safety cushions and so on and so forth, because this, I believe, is absolutely important against such uncertainties playing themselves out against you. The next question from Elena Fabricne, Reuters. As is known, Russia bought out of the National Welfare Fund Aeroflot's shares and is going to convert them in the market, and how the daily currency sales are going to evolve because of that. Well, indeed, we're currently pursuing currency transactions related to the National Welfare Fund, and whenever we are transacting like that, they are irregular, actually. We have regular ones when we are working inside the fiscal rule, but there are irregular ones as well. And as we stated previously, the principle that we adhere to in our policy is to compensate for this impact upon the currency market. And at the same time, we are doing everything we can to maintain a very transparent policy. And against the normal conditions, we're going to follow a very simple kind of approach, which we had discussed previously, because the acquisition of Aeroflot stock with the National Welfare Fund is not the first transaction of its nature. All of such transactions we are going to run through the domestic currency market, apart from the regular ones, in the amount of not more than 4 billion rubles worth. As you may recall, we have already sold Sberbank shares as a set-off in terms of the Sberbanks, transacting in different other lines. So we did this kind of a offsetting, and so we're selling the currencies right now in the amount of 2.9 billion rubles worth of hard currency. And so, respectively, within this kind of a general approach, when we have defined a certain amount, which we see that is not going to negatively impact the market, being at such a level, as of Monday already, we plan to increase sales up to this $4 billion as an addition to previous sales. Now, and as far as of such additional sales schedule, we will publish in a press release that we will disclose tonight. Thank you. Once again, good evening, Elvira Sekivzana. Anna Britkova from Forbes. I've got a question to ask you, to be more specific. Many analysts are saying that the forthcoming US elections may seriously impact the Russian financial system. Do you agree to such a view? For example, Deutsche Bank has stated that after November, it doesn't rule out that the long-term ruble positions may come back. To what extent do you agree that very serious contribution and sanctional risks may make into this by the US elections? And the second specific question, recently the National Financial Research Agency published its report that the level of trust to the Russian banking system is at a minimum level over the past 5 years. What does the Bank of Russia think about this? And will there be any measures undertaken in order to raise this level of trust? Now, as far as the US elections and the sanctional risk situations is concerned, and principally speaking, yes, this could turn out to be one of the volatility sources in the global markets, but not necessarily. This is not predetermined. But this is the kind of risk which we definitely take into account in our forecast. Now, and as far as the possible sanctions are concerned, we've already grown used living under the threat of constant sanctions and threats. There's no surprise that we expect here to happen. Most importantly, we need to improve the stability, financial stability of our systems and economy to possible negative consequences and effects, which is exactly what is happening right now. And as far as the foreign investors are concerned, we see that overall the foreign investors, they consider the risks. There are periods when investors are ready to invest into much riskier assets in the emerging markets, followed by the periods of when they invest into more reliable assets. And these convolutions do happen. Specific Russian factors are also taken by them into account. But most importantly is that this kind of trust we do anticipate is being overall affected by the uncertainty of the first few months of the lockdown, but it gradually recovers, so we do not expect any serious changes to occur. And the most important thing we see is that non-residents of the recent times they're not going from the market. For example, the volume that is attributable to them in the government bond market remains quite stable. Sorry, about 3 trillion rubles worth. Next, Rita Shpilevskaya from TASS agency. Does central bank see any prerequisites to ease the deposit market regulation against the lower rates and completing the recovery of the sector? Well, first of all, this year, in the pandemic, we made a decision to reduce the rates of contributions into the deposit insurance agency, because that does affect the cost of the deposit. To maintain the deposit, we have reduced not only the core rate, the principal, but also the additional rate, the alleviated rate, and we will further follow the situation. Now, speaking about a different kind of regulation which may affect the rates, I guess we're talking about the forwards. No, we're not going to introduce any changes. A higher rate with regards to the currency forwards is a very predetermined policy to diminish the currency content. As far as the ruble rates are concerned, they're quite moderate, 4.25 for all of the banks, and I believe 1 percentage point for the banks with a basic license. It is a necessary instrument in order to develop a very stable demand on the side of the banks for the liquidity in their correspondent accounts, which is one of the elements for us to pursue our monetary policy. And amongst other things, if any extraordinary events happen, that also creates the possibility to provide liquidity in an urgent way to the banking system, considering its uneven distribution. So this base rate in rubles, 4.75, it is, we believe, is quite neutral, quite moderate, and there are no prerequisites to reduce it. And that was the last question. I'm very grateful to you for your attention. Thank you very much, and keep well.